Cuba and China warn Trump to remove his military from the Caribbean. The Caribbean is heating up once again, but this time it's not because of hurricanes or tropical storms. It's because of Donald Trump's latest military move, sending U.S. warships into the region under the banner of fighting drug trafficking. To many, this might sound like just another American operation, but to others, it's a dangerous escalation. Two powerful voices, Cuba and China, are now openly warning Trump to back off, calling the deployment a direct threat to peace and sovereignty in the Caribbean. This isn't just a small diplomatic protest. Cuba, a nation with decades of history resisting U.S. pressure, is calling Trump's warship presence an outright militarization of the region. And China, the world's second-largest superpower, has stepped in to condemn America's actions, accusing Washington of destabilizing Latin America under false pretenses. Together, these two nations are sending a message loud and clear: the Caribbean is not Washington's playground. So the big question is this just a war of words, or are we witnessing the early stages of a new Cold War playing out in the Caribbean? Before you dismiss it, let's take a closer look at what Trump has done and why Cuba and China are so alarmed. What Trump did. Donald Trump has ordered the deployment of U.S. naval warships, surveillance aircraft, and military personnel into the Caribbean, positioning them close to Venezuela. Officially, the White House says this is about stopping international drug cartels and preventing narcotics from flowing into the United States. Trump and his administration argue that criminal networks are using the Caribbean as a highway for smuggling operations and that U.S. forces need to intercept them at sea. But this explanation has raised eyebrows across the region. Critics point out that the U.S. already has extensive drug interdiction programs and Coast Guard operations in place. The sudden surge of warships, especially near Venezuela, doesn't look like an anti-drug mission to many observers. Instead, it looks more like a strategic military buildup aimed at intimidating the Venezuelan government, which remains one of Washington's strongest rivals in the hemisphere. This move also comes at a time when Venezuela's oil reserves are back in the global spotlight and when U.S. sanctions have failed to topple the government in Caracas. To Cuba and China, the message is obvious. Washington is using drug cartels as a pretext to tighten its grip on the Caribbean and pressure Venezuela into submission. Cuba's warning. Havana wasted no time in denouncing Trump's decision. The Cuban government described the U.S. deployment as a dangerous militarization of the Caribbean, one that threatens the peace and stability of the entire region. They argue that drug trafficking is just a smokescreen and that the true objective is political: to isolate and eventually seize control of Venezuela's vast oil wealth. For Cuba, this is nothing new. They see it as part of the same U.S. playbook used for decades in Latin America. Cuba also accuses Washington of hypocrisy. The United States, they argue, has long been the biggest market for narcotics, yet instead of addressing demand at home, it sends warships abroad under the guise of fighting cartels. Cuban officials have urged the United Nations and the global community to take notice and resist what they call an aggressive show of force by Trump's administration. To them, this is not about drugs, it's about hegemony. Perhaps most significantly, Cuba is warning that these actions destabilize the entire Caribbean basin. By flexing military power so close to its neighbors, the U.S. is reviving memories of past interventions and invasions. For small island nations that prize their sovereignty, Cuba's message is a chilling reminder that one superpower's decisions can put the whole region at risk. China's warning. Then came Beijing's response, and it was equally sharp. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemned the U.S. deployment, saying it seriously undermines peace and security in Latin America. They stressed that Venezuela, like any other country, has the right to sovereignty without external interference. Beijing rejected the U.S. justification of fighting drug cartels, calling it a weak excuse for military adventurism. China's warning goes beyond just defending Venezuela. It directly challenges Washington's long-standing view of the Caribbean as its backyard. In China's words, Latin America is not owned by the United States, and the days of Cold War-style interventions are over. By framing the issue this way, Beijing is not only defending its partner Venezuela, but also signaling its growing role as a global counterweight to U.S. power. This clash also ties into the wider U.S.-China rivalry. In recent years, Beijing has built strong economic partnerships across Latin America and the Caribbean, investing in infrastructure, energy, and trade. By condemning Trump's warship deployment, China is sending a dual message that it will not tolerate U.S. interference with its partners and that the Caribbean is no longer a one superpower region. The bigger picture. When we step back, this is about much more than just warships. What we're seeing is the Caribbean becoming a frontline in a larger struggle over power, resources, and sovereignty. For Trump, projecting force in the region demonstrates strength to both his domestic audience and his adversaries abroad. But for Cuba and China, it represents the dangerous return of U.S. gunboat diplomacy. The stakes are especially high because of Venezuela's oil reserves, which remain some of the largest in the world. Cuba insists that Washington's true motive is to seize this oil wealth under the guise of a drug war. China, meanwhile, sees Venezuela as a strategic partner in its Belt and Road Initiative, making Trump's military buildup a direct challenge to Beijing's interests in the Western Hemisphere. The Caribbean, once thought of as a quiet corner of global politics, may now find itself at the heart of a new geopolitical contest. With Cuba and China drawing red lines, and Trump unwilling to back down, the region could easily become the stage for the next great power showdown. So here we are, Trump's warships sailing in the Caribbean, with Cuba calling it militarization and China calling it destabilization. Both nations are warning Washington to remove its forces, arguing that peace in the region is at stake. Yet so far, Trump has shown no signs of retreat. This confrontation isn't just about ships and submarines. It's about who controls the future of the Caribbean. Will it remain America's so-called backyard, or will nations like Cuba and partners like China succeed in pushing back against U.S. dominance? One thing is certain, the Caribbean is no longer being ignored on the global stage. And as the warnings from Havana and Beijing grow louder, the world is watching closely to see if Trump will double down, or if this crisis will push the region toward a new Cold War.